Well, greetings, everybody. I'm Roddy Gow, the chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, and we're delighted and privileged to be doing this event with the National Trust for Scotland. It's the first we've done, and the beginning of what I'm sure will be a long and very fruitful relationship. So the topic that we are speaking about today, led by Antonia Lawrence Allen, is the collection of photographs from Broughton House of Sri Lanka, taken by Edward Atkinson Hornel, known as Ned, in 1907. And perhaps I could just start off by referring to the long links between Scotland and then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, which is part of the mission that we have at the Asia Scotland Institute to educate and inspire, particularly tomorrow's leaders, to gain a better understanding of the countries and cultures of Pan-Asia in this, the century of Asia. And it's an easy thing to do in the sense that very many men and women from Scotland went and worked and lived in Asia. And indeed, whilst when I was young, people said, go west, young man, now it's go east, young person. So let's talk just a little bit about Sri Lanka, if I may, to get us going. The British connections with Sri Lanka date back to 1795, because before that, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the British dominated the island for all sorts of reasons. It was the Pearl of India, a very important trade route and an important market. The British connection started in 1795, and the main influence has been one of tea. Ceylon tea was brought first by James Taylor, who left Scotland in 1852. And then he was followed by Robert Bruce in 1823. And then finally, the very well-known Tommy or Sir Thomas Lipton, who had been brought up in Glasgow, where in 1850, the firm or the family had one store. And by 1880, they had 20. And by 1890, 300. And so we'll learn a little bit about that as we hear from Antonia, I'm sure. The other thing to remind ourselves is that Ceylon became Sri Lanka in February 1948, when it gained independence from Great Britain. The thing I just wanted to mention, I think, first is that let's just talk about, let me find my document here. And Antonia has very significant knowledge of photography. She is, as we all know, based in Edinburgh, and she is currently heading up photographic and other details in Scotland. And she will tell us about this collection, how it came to be brought together, and fill us in on all of that. So Antonia, thank you for leading us through this, and over to you.
No problem. Thank you for the introduction very much. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen so that people can see the images and not me, which would be a lot nicer. Let's see, here we go. Perfect, good. Well, thank you very much. So this afternoon, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of Sri Lanka. Last year, I was invited by the National Trust of Sri Lanka and the British Council to speak about the photographs in an exhibition that was travelling through the country. This was after my own research into an artist that we can see here, Edward Atkinson Hornel, as Ned, as Roddy says, and his archive at Broughton House, and an exhibition that we did with the City Arts Centre in 2020. So, let me see. There we go. As we go, think about what a photograph actually is. It's literally an image created with sunlight, impressed, if you like, with light that shines in through a lens and imprints an image on a surface. These are images from glass plates, which in themselves are reflective physical objects, retaining and filtering light. And this afternoon, I want to take you on a journey into these images, why Hornel took them, how he became a traveller and a photographer alongside his wildly successful painting career in Scotland, and to use this metaphor of double exposures and shadows to suggest that these kind of photograph archives can be used most effectively when used as mirrors that allow contemporary audiences to see themselves reflected. So first, just quickly, who am I and how did I get to Sri Lanka? So I'm a regional curator for the National Trust of Scotland. I look after a range of properties from the townhouses that you can see here, like the Georgian House on Charlotte Square, to Preston Mill, the mills that are working in the Victorian era and earlier, from estates like top right here, Hill of Tarvit in Cooper, which is in Fife, and shops like Robert Smales, which was the last operational Victorian printing works in Innerleithen and in the Borders. And then there are merchant houses like Curris, which is in Fife here, the yellow house at the bottom, and homes that have developed over hundreds and hundreds of years, like Kelly Castle that you can see in the bottom right here, which started as a tower house in the 14th century and evolved and became the home of the arts and crafts Lorimer family in the 19th century. My academic background includes work in the history of photography, and in 2015 I acquired funding from a charitable trust to uncover the National Trust of Scotland's photographic collections, unearthing and working with archives in a range of sites, from Canna in the Hebrides to Brodie, west of Forres in Moray up north, and the tenement house in Garnet Hill in Glasgow. And this included Broughton House in the border town of Kirkcudbright, where I found a large collection of glass plates and prints. This is a wall in the gallery at the centre of the house, and you can see that among the paintings which traditionally hung here, I added panels of photographs showing how these images were used by the artist to compose his paintings. These are specifically from a trip that Hornel took to Myanmar in 1920, which I'll touch on later, and these are from a trip that he took to Japan in 1893. Now I'm starting here because back in 2015 I began my research into Hornell's photography and started to understand how the camera was giving him access to people and to places. It helped him build a visual library from which he could refresh his memory and take inspiration. He literally copied figures, poses, and imagery directly from photographs, and I think he was also affected by the framing of the camera eye. Now here you can see what I mean. This is a really small painting which mimics the Japanese commercial print known as a Yokohama shashin, which Hornel collected many. And look at the way he's cropping the picture using a dark vertical line. He's designing the picture like a photographer might crop a contact sheet. The camera was, therefore, I think, his guiding tool, something that gave him the basic outline or grounding from which he could explore a scene with his paintbrush. I've also understood over time that there is a more challenging context here. There are hundreds of photographs of girls and women in Hornell's collection. This is one of the Scottish girls who posed for him. The girls were brought to Broughton House by their mothers and chaperoned by Hornell's sister Elizabeth. But these kind of images are still quite discomforting to the modern eye. That's Elizabeth there that you can see holding up the sort of backdrop cloth. In the collection, there are many photographs of girls and young women in Sri Lanka that appear really intimate and kind of intrusive. The girls are young and they do often seem highly uncomfortable. It's worth noting that the camera was used from its inception as a tool for documenting the colonial world. In Britain, it was literally viewed as a lantern that could literally shine a light into what was considered the darkest corners of the empire. In this context, the photographs and Hornell's paintings sort of take on a different feel. And so we don't know any of the girls' names. They are the result of posed sessions that were organized for the artist as he traveled. In a letter that he wrote to a friend towards the end of his trip in 1907, Hornel notes that it has been a success. He said he's gathered the subjects he can use when comfortably back in his studio in Scotland. And this is what he writes. I've got a great deal of work done, work which will take a lot of digesting and pulling together before being made public. I feel, however, I have got some good subjects, and if I was once in the quiet and congenial environment of Broughton House, I have hopes of making it the best I have ever done. So before we go into that and into the photographs, I just want to step back and let you know who Hornel is, how he became a traveller, and where he developed his painting style. This will lead us on to the purpose of his trip to Sri Lanka in 1907 and how the photographs he gathered on his travels were used by him, and then how we're going to use them now. Edward's father was William Lidderdale Hornel, and he was born in Kirkcudbright in 1822. He was the second of 11 children. Kirkcudbright, if you don't know, is a small town on the left bank of the River Dee. Today it's about 2 hours drive from Edinburgh, but back in the 1840s it was probably about a day's journey. It's described at the time as one of the more picturesque county towns in Scotland. Some called it the Venice of Scotland because as the tide comes in and out of the estuary, it changes the landscape. It has a ruined medieval castle, a townhouse, and an abbey, giving it that heritage and history. Edward's father, William, followed his own father into the family boot and shoemaking business, something that Kirkcudbright was quite famed for. Their ancestor, John, had been a deacon of the Shoemakers Guild back in the 1780s, so he was a master of the trade. Edward's parents married in 1854, and they lived and worked here on the High Street. Their first child, Margaret, was born the following year. Then, in November 1856, with a second child on the way, the young family sailed from Liverpool to Australia on a ship very much like this called the Shooting Star. They're heading to Melbourne, presumably following the promise of fortune, because just 6 years earlier gold had been discovered here. Edward's parents, his elder sister, his uncles Samuel and Charles, and his aunt Janet, with her new husband, all came on the journey, which took weeks and weeks, and there are accounts of trips of livestock bellowing in the hold and scurvy and food rotting and smallpox running rampant. But amazingly, against all these odds, the family arrived safe, Edward's mother having given birth to a baby girl on the journey. The family stayed in Melbourne for about a year, but the gold yields were already failing and wages had slumped. Unemployment was on the rise, so Edward's father decided to move his young family to Bacchus Marsh, a small township about 35 miles northwest of the big city. It was an early agricultural settlement where sheep and cattle farmed, but by the 1850s there was one road through the town, went about 2 miles. It had some shops and houses and hotels that were doing okay. And actually, Edward's father established a really successful bootmaking business here, so successful, in fact, that in 10 years he'd purchased the land, and on his death here in 1879, he was the owner of 3 farms and over 1,300 acres. So while William was growing his business, the family too expanded. This is a later picture of William's wife Anne and some of her children. There's Edward holding onto the railing, and below his right elbow is his older sister, Elizabeth. The eldest, Margaret, is on the top step. The other 2 sisters are Janet and Grace. Sadly, 2 of Edward's siblings died in Australia, one only 6 weeks old, and the other aged 7. And we think that it was losing these children that made the family decide to return home. So they came back to Kirkcudbright in 1866 when Edward and his twin brother were 2 years old. With land in Australia providing a steady income and their shoe business successfully resumed in Kirkcudbright, the family had a good life. Edward got to know his father's side of the family, including his cousin James, who was almost the same age. This is important for our story, as James was likely the reason that Edward chose to visit Sri Lanka in 1907. First, there are 3 things that come together to take him there: his art career, his use of photography, and his desire to travel. His art career starts at 16, when his mother showed some of his drawings to a picture restorer in the town and suggested that Edward take art lessons to establish his skill. His sister Elizabeth was teaching in Edinburgh, and so it was decided that she could keep an eye on him, and he started at the School of Art here at the Academy building on Princes Street in Edinburgh. He wanted to study painting, but the school was incredibly large. There were about 800 students, and the curriculum was very rigid. He was very unhappy here, spending large amounts of time just copying from prints and plaster casts. So he decided to leave in 1883. Before he left, though, he would have seen the paintings of this Kirkcudbright man, William Mountsie, in the 1881 Royal Academy exhibition in Edinburgh. Mountsie was married to Hornel's older sister, Margaret. His work was described by critics as luminous and powerful, and distinguished for being the product of a man who had no training in art schools. Mountsie had started his career painting houses, not canvases. I think Edward was likely inspired by his brother-in-law, who did not have official training. He used an expressive dash and splash of paint and had a passion for Kirkcudbright landscapes. So from the very start of his painting career, Edward enjoyed local subjects and studying from life, and he was drawn to the working people in his town and the moments of solitude and quiet and the rough-hewn hands of labour. This early painting and sketch, these were both finished after he returned from some time attending school in Belgium, and this is where he truly learnt to paint. After leaving Edinburgh frustrated in the mid-1883, he decided to study instead at Antwerp's Royal Academy of Beaux-Arts. I believe he was drawn here because of its tradition for teaching painting from life and capturing the everyday. The curriculum was well known for encouraging students to paint outside. The academy had been set up by David Teniers the Younger and continued a Dutch and Flemish tradition for capturing real people in ordinary settings. When Hornel joined, he joined classes taught by Charles Verlat, a painter who had spent 19 years in Paris and was particularly influenced by the work of French realists like Courbet and Millet. The earthy paint palette, quiet, steady atmosphere, and the focus on elevating the labours of rural life were all absorbed by Hornel. He loved his training in Antwerp, and he remembered it as the happiest period of his life. And I think it certainly launched a passion for energetically painting the local. Here are two more studies, early studies of landscape, where he's beginning to experiment with brushstrokes and colour. Now, by this time, it's 1887, he's 23 years old, and he's becoming better known in Scottish art circles. In these early years, he meets fellow artist George Henry, 6 years his senior, and they become friends. They correspond and they paint together, Henry going to Kirkcudbright and Hornel to Glasgow, both working alongside one another and sharing studio space. Henry was from Ayrshire on the west coast of Scotland and an early member of a young group of artists who became known as the Glasgow Boys. From about 1880, the Glasgow Boys were challenging the tradition that was really dominating the Scottish Academy at the time, that's basically sort of defined by this image by Landseer that was commissioned by the Houses of Parliament and fed a stereotype of Scotland as a sort of macho land of mountains and glens. The Glasgow Boys, on the other hand, were keen to focus on urban life and rural work. They wanted to stand alongside the French realists, adding colour to everyday people. Hornel wasn't a member, but he was heavily associated with the group. And in 1890, the two friends, Hornel and Henry, came together to create this innovative painting. It illustrates Celtic priests or druids in richly decorated robes, walking down a wooded, snowy hillside in the moonlight. Now, this might seem quite a strange painting after all I've mentioned about their interest in depicting everyday life, but Hornel was particularly interested in archaeology, the history of the ancient Scots. He collected books, he studied geography and geology of the landscape, and this painting was kind of a deeper look into the ancient nature of landscape, a sort of underpinning of an everyday scene, what lies beneath. And take a close look at the painting technique. He and Henry were sharing this canvas, and their brushes are uniting in a way that is really pushing the younger Hornel to paint in a really different way. The form is built up of blocks of colour and an expressive brushstroke. It's a much bolder form of painting than he has done before. And the following year, he paints this picture, which moves away from the russets and browns of the previous landscapes and the empty sort of landscape to a more decorative composition filled with movement and light and shadow. The foreground is broad, the swish and the swirl of the girl's skirt is echoed in the brush strokes that creates a sort of circle of movement, and the laughing girl kind of rolls through the whole composition. It was actually the first painting by an artist associated with the Glasgow Boys to be purchased by a public institution. It was bought by the Liverpool Corporation the year after it was painted, and it was openly discussed, many being confused by its passionate quest for colour and expression over realism. People literally stood in front of this painting, desperately hunting for the cows in the background, as though it was some sort of puzzle. And what's interesting for me isn't so much the patchwork of paint, but the method by which Hornel composed it. It seems to be one of the first times he uses the camera as an aid, and this photograph is from the collection at Broughton House, and it directly matches the laughing girl in the painting with her hobnail boots. So we know that from quite an early stage, Hornel was using the camera to capture casual movements and gestures, and then blending that with a new form of patterned painting. Many painters use photographs as aids. This wasn't kind of unusual at all. Amongst friends, there was a sharing of photographs. Hornel's fellow painters in Glasgow, like John Lavery here and James Patterson, they were using the camera too. Before Lavery's career actually as a painter, he had a job hand tinting photographs for a commercial studio in Glasgow. And Patterson, He has an archive of photographs that's vast, which is now held at Glasgow University. He certainly used a camera to compose many of his paintings, like this one of his new wife, painted in 1884. It's the Glasgow art scene that provides Hornel with his first opportunity to travel for work. The art dealer Alexander Reed, pictured here, painted by Van Gogh, sponsored a trip to Japan in 1893 for Hornel and George Henry. He did this so he could then sell their new paintings in his gallery. Reed was the first to sell Impressionist painting in Scotland and staged some of the first exhibitions of Japanese art, including Hokusai prints. Japan had only really opened up to tourism and international trade in the 1860s, and Glasgow consumers were starting to see silks and kimonos, china, prints and lacquerware appearing on their high streets. And young artists like Hornel and Henry were extremely keen to see the country for themselves and to tap into this new market. They arrived at the start of May 1893 and lived in this area along the Sumida River, designated for Westerners. They were greeted by a community of Scots living and working in the country, including this man, William Kinnaman Burton, who had been in Japan for some time teaching engineering at Imperial University. Burton had helped set up Japan's first photographic studio and society, and asked Henry and Hornel to help him install a huge exhibition of photography that opened on May the 13th, 1893. This was an exhibition on tour from London's Camera Club, which was designed to promote the latest work of pictorialism, that is, work from photographers like Cameron and Emerson here, who were keen to demonstrate how the camera could rival painting and be used to create pictures filled with personal expression and creativity. This photograph in the middle was taken by Hornel when he returned to Scotland, and it seems clear to me that pictorialism has influenced the way Hornel uses the camera, not just seeing it as a tool for documenting, but as a way of looking and framing his compositions. He came home with a hearty collection of photographs, and you can see how he's used them to compose and design his paintings, from the vertical composition to the focus on traditional costume and poses. His exhibition of Japanese paintings at Alexander Reed's gallery in April 1895 was a roaring success, and he sold 23 out of 30 paintings. The reviews were literally effervescent. Here's one. One critic says, "Hornel's pictures of Japan are going well, and if you want to secure one or more, you'd best call early. Nothing like them has ever been seen in the city. They are extraordinary, magnificent, and sublime." Hornel went on to translate what he had learnt abroad into his local landscape. You can see here how his paintings have become more decorative and the perspective has flattened. While he collected photographs, he also used the camera to capture girls posing inside and outside in nature. And he created a formulaic method for painting, hands and faces remaining photographic, but set in a flurry of colourful paint that wasn't designed to be a specific time or place, but rather a bucolic idyll that provided an escape from reality. And these paintings were incredibly popular with consumers because this was in a time of increasing industrialisation and nostalgia in Scotland. His commercial success allowed him to purchase this house, Broughton House, in 1900. Known as one of the grandest in Kirkcudbright, it had been built in the 1730s and extended in the 1800s. It was unique in being one of the only to be set back and raised up from the high street. He added this studio extension that you can see here with its glass roofs to let in as much natural light as possible. The studio in this gallery was finished by 1909. It was a really clever design. The gallery here, being both a large, comfy sitting room and a commercial space for Hornel, added a trap door that you can see there into the floor, so paintings could be winched up and displayed for friends and clients on the gallery wall. If you look at the end of this picture at the very back there, you can see a door that will take you into the studio at the end as well. Alexander Reed held exhibitions of his work in 1901, 1902, and 1903, all of which championed Hornel as an artist of flowers and children. It's worth noting quickly that both of these subjects were considered emblems of innocence. The Victorians particularly had used childhood and flowers as symbols of the beauty of God's natural world. Hornell's work and process was well publicized, and it was not meant or received as subversive or troubling. Instead, it was considered uplifting. The Studio, an art magazine, ran an article in 1907 describing how Hornell gathered his subject matter, and I'm going to read it now. The article says, "The usual method with children is to get them into your studio, keep them as quiet as you can with the aid of relatives, lollipops, and anecdotes, and paint them in a set pose. Hornell's method is different and better. He has a fine old house in Kirkcudbright, sat in a large old garden, and he has improved its amenity by buying and demolishing or improving undesirable surroundings. All about his doors are the children of the poor, many of them with their peculiar and fascinating red hair of Galloway, which he has so often painted, and is said to be unlike any human crop. His garden is full of flowers, and the flowers of humanity are free to come in from the street and enjoy themselves in it. He meanwhile studies and paints them, the flowers and the children, in the open air. Thus his pictures are always spontaneous, full of daylight, and lovely and colourful. There never was a more thoroughgoing impressionist." So the art critic writing this appreciation concludes his piece by telling the reader, "Early this year I wished Hornel and his sister Godspeed before they sailed off for Ceylon, where he has gone in quest of new inspiration, just as he went off some 14 years ago with Henry to Japan. I look forward with eager anticipation to the result. The land and its flowers are new and splendid, its naked babies are copper-coloured, it is full of wonders that have been little noticed by European art." And so here we are in 1907 as Hornell searches for what we've now heard described as a, quote, human crop, subjects that are like the flowers of childhood, untainted babies of the world not touched by European progress. So this is sort of framed as a perfect colonial quest, taking the camera to capture some sort of naked truth. Hornell and his sister sailed from Liverpool to Colombo in February of 1907. They spent 8 months travelling through the island, spending most time in Gaul on the south coast, Kandy in the central province, and visiting the Gulf of Mannar near Jaffna in the northern province. They would go to Australia in late September to visit their birthplace and their father's grave, before returning to Colombo in late November to catch a boat back to Scotland in time for Christmas. Loosely, the photographs he took and collected can be sorted into 3 categories: fishing in the north, tea plucking south of Kandy, and everyday life on the south coast. And we'll take these one by one. I'm sure a key reason to try Sri Lanka as a source of inspiration was guided by their cousin James, who had been working in the country for 5 years. He was a British government marine biologist and was assisting with an in-depth investigation into the decline of the pearl fisheries in the Gulf of Mannar. James would go on to Japan on the 15th of May that year, where this photograph was taken, to look into the pearl oyster fishery at Aoshima. Before his cousins arrived in Sri Lanka, he wrote to them, advising them of the heat in the country. He suggested they bring a good-size umbrella and, weirdly, sew a strip of red flannel into the back of their coats to protect their spines from the sun's rays. Whether they did this or not, I have no idea. I don't even know if it works. And this is why there are so many photographs of the fisheries in the collection at Broughton House, and they stand out as being unusual in the collection for their focus on working men and activity instead of girls and children posing. This is because Edward is being guided by his cousin, who is showing him the work they're doing at Manor. On the left, you can see James in a diver's suit, ready to investigate the pearl beds. This photograph is actually not at Broughton House. It's in James Hornell's collection of photographs, held in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. What I've discovered is that the cousins clearly shared photographs. This other image of the fishing boats coming into the shore is a glass plate from Edward's collection at Broughton House, but there is a print of the exact same image in his cousin's collection at Cambridge. And here are 2 more. The glass plate is at Broughton House, and the print is in Cambridge and belonged to James. Now, James was taking photographs of the pearl fishing to record the procedures and the life cycle of the pearl, whereas Edward's using the photographs, as I said, for inspiration, for aesthetic purposes, so he can remember the figures when he gets back to Scotland. Now, we know that Edward was taking photographs. Firstly, he found it hard to sketch while at the pearl fisheries. He wrote to a friend at one point saying that the heat and the smell of the oysters left on the shore to rot was so strong he could not bear to sit for any length of time and sketch. And secondly, years later, James writes a letter to his cousin saying he has left Edward's photographs in Madras and is annoyed because he needs them to help him illustrate an article. So this suggests that James and Edward are taking and sharing prints. But there's one more man that I'm interested in who's also sharing photographs. This image is in James's collection. It shows a bisected pearl. It's not in Edward's collection at Broughton House because it's of little use to his painting, but it is duplicated in another collection held at the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh. This image on the right is a lantern slide that belonged to a man called Everard Intherne. Everard was the acting governor of Sri Lanka from 1902 to 1904, and he met James Hornel when arriving to oversee the fishery process, including the valuation of pearls. The close-up image here that you saw just a few minutes ago shows James in his diver's suit with two men peering at the camera next to him. The other image of the boat from a distance is in Everard's collection at the National Museum of Scotland. In this, you can see the man in the white hat and James pausing on the side of the boat before putting on his diving helmet, documenting his research and for publications that he assiduously produced over the following decades. Everard turned his photographs into lantern slides to illustrate talks. All these men took similar photographs, but used them in very different ways. Everard supported what was known at the time as the Colonial Office for Visual Instruction Committee, the members of which used lantern slide lectures to propagate views of the British Empire. Before leaving Sri Lanka, Everard himself did publish an article titled A Sketch of the Ceylon Pearl Fishery of 1903, which was featured in the Colombo Museum's journal Spoiler Zelenica. So he's reporting on the processes that he's overseeing and uses the photograph to help him. Some of Everard's images are direct copies of James's, suggesting they were sharing photographs. But I do know that Everard was taking his own images and had a camera with him. And I know this because he was traveling sometimes with his wife, and his wife was writing home to his mother. And his wife, was Hannah Lorimer, whose family home was Kelly Castle in Fife, a property that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Hannah is the eldest sibling of a family that were hugely creative and influential in Scottish society. Her father was a professor of international law at Edinburgh University, her brother John Henry, a successful painter. Her younger brother Robert would go on to become Scotland's most successful architect. She herself was a fine painter and a sculptor, and this small plaster cast is at Kelly. We think it was done while she was in Sri Lanka, where she joined her husband and travelled through the country in 1902. On the left here is a photograph of James Hornel 4 years later in 1906. You can just see him on the right of the photograph wearing his white pith sun hat, admiring the view near the summit of Sigiriya, an ancient rock fortress located north of Kandy in Central Province. In August 1902, Hannah and Everard did this same hike and attempted to take photographs, but they were prevented from doing so because it was too windy. Hannah wrote so much so to her mother, describing their day at Sigiriya. She writes, "On the rock are endless formations of walls and cisterns, baths and stone platforms and seats. Every inch of place is utilized, and the most marvelous thing of all are the frescoes that are over 1,000 years old and as fresh as the day they were painted. They're a procession of ladies carrying lilies and other flowers. In drawing, they are rather like Botticelli's and quite different from anything else in Ceylon." So this is exactly what Hannah is talking about. The paintings featured along the south face of the rock at Sigiriya, more than 100 meters above the ground. It's a giant picture gallery that has wowed visitors ever since archaeological work started here in 1894. Hannah ends her description of this by saying to her mother at Kelly, "These frescoes would interest Mrs. Traquair hugely. The Mrs. Traquair that Hannah mentions is Phoebe Anna Traquair, the artist who paints this mural at Kelly just 12 years before in 1890. Now, Mrs. Traquair was an Irish painter working in Scotland who was friends with Hannah's brothers, and she specializes in murals. And Hannah mentions Botticelli because the Kelly mural has always been compared to this painting of spring in that typical way that Westerners reach back to ancient Italy for reassuring links to a classical past. Now, Hannah taught art history at one point, so she didn't know about the 5th century Sri Lankan murals. They were beyond her scope of understanding. So Botticelli's Italian 15th century work is the closest reference that she can provide her Christian mother, and she knew that her mother would understand. So this detour from Broughton House is a bit relevant for the photographs collected because Hannah and her husband are collecting similar images to Edward Hornel, who is also touring and working in the country. They both purchased, for example, commercial prints like these of archaeological ruins of temple complexes, and they collected images of local life like these that are showing the process of milling. This moves me on to the next group of photographs that can be found in Edward's collection of Broughton House, which are more staged and capture women and girls on the tea plantations in the south of the country. In a letter written to a friend after 7 months traveling in the country, Edward hints at the facilities that they're being given to help progress his work and how they relied on the kindness of strangers and most enjoyed the moments when colonial life provided a respite from tropical realities. So he writes to his friend, "I must say we've had a very pleasant time in Ceylon. We have experienced great kindness from everybody, and we will leave, I think, with only pleasant memories of it. In fact, we had, I think, the best times in Gaul, and there we found our best subjects and got the bulk of our work done. We got to know some of the best Sinhalese families intimately, which should be of great use to me in my work, and give me facilities I could not possibly have had otherwise. After leaving Gaul, we went up to the tea country and had our first breath of cold air. We lived in a bungalow with friends, 5,600 feet up. English flowers bloomed, and we heard the song of the blackbird, night and morning. It was a nice change after the sultry tropical heat of the low country. Now we are in Kandy. It's a beautiful town with a fine botanical garden 4 miles out, where I'm finding excellent material, and will remain working here until the grand finale. We are looking forward to our trip to Australia and mean to have a good time. We will leave all the paint and canvases behind and give ourselves up to enjoyment." So this letter, I think, is really important. It tells us something of his process. He had facilities to help him gather photographs, but he was also painting and had canvases delivered along the way. And he certainly talks about government experts being very helpful and attentive, being introduced to local families and staying with British families across the country. There are many photographs like these of women and girls clearly being posed for the camera. To get an idea of how these staged sessions were organized, however, we have to go to a very different time and place, some years later, in 1920, when Edward and Elizabeth are traveling in Myanmar. Here they are in the studio there. This was a country their cousin James had also spent time in the year before, and he personally professed to like the Burmese girls more than the ones in Japan, saying the Burmese girls are more lively, natural and independent than their Japanese counterparts. Edward wrote to a friend in 1920 mentioning that he had met a theatre manager here in Mandalay who had agreed to organise a performance of his best dancers and was personally seeing to it that they would be posed correctly so Edward could photograph their traditional movements. If you look closely at the background and the carpet, you can see Edward and his sister are sitting in the same place the girls are modelling for them. The Scottish siblings look tired, and their dusty shoes and sweaty brows gives you a sense of their discomfort. Back in Sri Lanka, you can see what I presume to be Elizabeth's skirt behind the girl top right, a girl that appears with her young friends in a range of photographs, clearly posing for the camera. These are girls in the south of the island. Hornel, in another letter to a friend, eulogizes about this area. He wrote, "After a month at the pearl fisheries, I came down here to this old world place, a place not unlike the old town of Kukubri in many ways. It's an old fortified town. Life is very quiet and the women dress very smartly. I found the material I came to paint, and I have enjoyed the change of subject and colour arrangements, and have no doubt it will do my future work at home a good deal better for the change. Then he ventures to the cool climes of the mountainous tea plantations. Here he's clearly using the same women to capture clothing differing silhouettes and movements as they heave their baskets or lift their arms to reach the leaves. All these photographs have been in the collection since they were bought here over 100 years ago, with incredibly little context except for Edward's paintings. And the paintings themselves really provide no context. They are fanciful arrangements designed to delight the Western eye. His work sold to collectors because of its fresh colour, and it's a colour that Hornel completely invented. He specifically moans about the lack of bright colour in the Sri Lankan landscapes. For example, in another letter to a friend at one point during the trip, he laments, "I've been much disappointed with Ceylon as far as flowers and fruit are concerned. There are practically no flowers. You look over vast tracts here, and they are just never once arrested by patches of flowers and colour as it is at home." I find this a rather typical colonial mindset, to go halfway round the world and compare it with home rather than seeing the beauty in difference. But Hornell's attitude to Ceylon was also advertised in a newspaper in Australia when he was there interviewed in October 1907. Hornell was asked whether Ceylon was good to paint, and his reply, "Yes, if you enjoy the black end of the palette," meaning a dull tone that you can see here, presumably as a result of the lack of bright flowers that he misses so much from his homeland. He wasn't comfortable with this at all, and he often augmented the scene when devising a painting. He adds colour where he desires it. For example, here, his work picturing the girls praying at a Buddhist shrine, he's added a green cloth where there was none in the original scene. And in the other painting of girls working lace, he has set them in a woodland glade with added shades of bright colour splashed about the scene. He augments the light here too, adding a dappled and fresh landscape with a background of trees that don't look at all like the realities of the coconut palm. He also changes the figures, making them more attractive to the European aesthetic. See the girl in the foreground? She's a lot more curvaceous in the painting, and what is a man in the photograph guiding the cattle in reality becomes a female figure in Hornell's adaptation. This reminds me that his main interest is flowers and girls. He has painted the faces and hands here in a photorealistic manner and has invented a slick landscape for them of water lilies and bright flowers, flowers that feel like home. I've included this painting that is set in the Bay of Kukubri, which, although was completed much later, does give you an idea of the palette that he's yearning for and ultimately cannot resist infusing into his Sri Lankan pictures. This brings me to conclude on some thoughts on how an archive of photographs like this can be used now in a truly productive way. Here you can see them on exhibition at Gaul, where they came from being on display at the University in Jaffna and the British Council building in Kandy in 2023, and on display some years earlier in Edinburgh. They fill in visual gaps and provide some concrete documentation to the artistic imagery that is better known, like these 1860s paintings by the Indian-born artist Hippolyte. And also they link archives of photographs that didn't remain in Sri Lanka, but lie on the shelves in institutions and private homes across Britain, like A.W. Andre Jr. here, who set up a commercial studio in Colombo and was working there at the time when the Hornell cousins were actually in the country. And I found Andre's photographs in albums in collections like the University of Cambridge, where this one is from. Hornell's images illustrate the sequence of events at the pearling fisheries in the Gulf of Mannar, an industry that no longer exists today, but was centuries old. In sharing these images, the NTS also benefits, though, as our documentation of these images has vastly improved. What was ships in the sea, men sitting drinking, and men standing on a boat has now become a fully fledged story. A Royal Naval ship monitors the progress of the fishing boats in the Mannar Basin. Fishing was controlled by the British government during colonial occupation, and they received a large percentage of profits from the industry. The division of harvested pearls was based on an age-old custom. 1/3 of the share went to the diver and the remainder to the government. As soon as the divisions were made, the government portion is then sold by auction. The season for pearl diving was from February to April, and fishing grounds were approximately 20 miles off the coast. After the blast of a gun from the superintendent on the shore, divers would go into the water holding a rope with a heavy stone placed on the end, which carried them rapidly to the bottom of the sea. They collected oysters in bags that hung around their neck or waist, and they remained underwater for at least 90 seconds. And many of these divers were from other places, including India and the Gulf Coast states of Bahrain, Qatar, and Aden. These latter divers were renowned for being the best and wore nose clips and leather straps on their arms that had good luck charms in them. They warded off sharks, and charmers came especially from the Middle East to Sri Lanka to sell these charms. The sea off the coast of Mannar is infested with sharks, stingrays, and highly venomous sea snakes. This is a practice that has died out in Sri Lanka. And as part of the 2023 exhibition, a university student made a graphic novel to teach children about their history. A village emerged from during the pearling season, which at peak times, this village could cater between 20 to 30,000 people over a 3-month period. Shanuka's book tells of the shark charmers and the tendency for divers to literally bleed from their ears when they dove too fast, too deep. By giving and sharing these archives, therefore, with a source country like Sri Lanka, students, universities, and national trust organizations can research and use them. Photographs, I think, are the most direct form of communication. They have human stories that are so easily relatable, showing people washing and talking, shopping, eating, playing, and working. When I was traveling last year, I had a driver who took me from pillar to post, literally. When we were in Kandy, I saw him staring at these 2 images, and I asked him what his thoughts were. He said, "These remind me of my grandfather. This head and this body wrap is exactly what he wore." And then he told me as we traveled the details about how this fisherman pulled in a day's catch and how the tsunami in 2004 literally wiped out his family's fishing business. His father fished, his brothers did too. And then when we were in Gaul, we drove past the beach and we saw men bringing in the day's catch. We stopped and I was asked to help. That's me in the middle there, not really helping huge amounts. But this fisher crew are the only ones on Gaul Beach that are still fishing this way on the south coast. It's a livelihood that's been overtaken by industrial processes and government contracts. So for me, taking these photographs out of the archive, I think provides 2 things. A chance, I think, to reconstruct the bodies that Hornel literally took apart, and also to fill in the specificity and detail of Sri Lanka's tangible and intangible heritage. A small story to end on that illustrates my point. These 2 images were pointed out to me by a student at Cambridge University who contacted me when she discovered our 2020 exhibition on Hornel's photography. She was the one who alerted me to James Hornel's archive. These images rang a bell in my mind and took me to Kelly Castle. I remembered that Hannah's husband, Everard, had written that report on the fisheries. In it, he wrote this: "We hope the small but effective laboratory at Gaul, which has served James Hornel for the last year as a base for researching the life history of the pearl oyster, would form the nucleus of a permanent biological station on the island." This area, actually, what I realized was for the marine group a really suitable point for a laboratory, because pearl oysters had been doing really well here in the shallow lagoons on the hard seabeds. So they tried to harvest them. It didn't work, but they tried. And when I was in Gaul, I showed these pictures to the head of the Heritage Foundation there, and he just shook his head. He said, "This is not here," pointing to that image there of the palm hut. He said, "There was never anything here like that." I asked him if he thought perhaps that a hut might have been there and whether he recognized the sea wall located in the other image. He did, and he took me to this spot where I took this photograph. And we stood there and talked about it. He was pleased and amazed that a part of the traditional Sinhalese fishing industry had touched this area. He knew nothing about it. And this is one of the main instigators for me in continuing to promote these images amongst students and teachers in Sri Lanka. As such, I'm in the midst of completing a book for the universities with the Sri Lankan Institute of Architects, written by experts in the country in a range of areas, including the Ceylon pearl fisheries and the botanical gardens near Kandy, which Hornel visited in search of his colourful flowers. And I think this is a fitting move for an archive of images that were initially created for one man's gain. It was a significant gain. After Hornell returned from Sri Lanka, he had several exhibitions in Glasgow, one in 1909, another in 1912, that made him over £2,000. Doesn't sound like much, but roughly equivalent to £280,000 today. And in 1917, he had a one-man show in London at Old Bond Street Gallery, and he was selling paintings for as much as £400, which is roughly 47 grand today. It's quite a lot of money. So it's important for me to go behind the paintings and not just look at the man who sat in front of them. For me, it seems flowers and females are of equal value to Hornell as literally a crop to be harvested. But inside these photographs are layers of livelihoods and traditions. The women that you can see buried in this double exposure, for example, are Tamils. They were immigrants from South India, brought to the plantations as indentured workers, paid incredibly little and given inadequate housing, healthcare, and opportunities to progress. Working conditions were extremely hard. Long days, repetitive, laborious work was rewarded with several coins and a crowded hut. If you look closely, you can see that these women are wearing decorative saris and bracelets. These are their entire worldly possessions. They wear everything, for they have nowhere to keep them safe. By reconstructing the bodies that Hornell takes apart for his painting career, I believe we can reappraise the context of these photographs and hope to reverse the erasure of their identities, these women's identities. I doubt we'll ever find out exactly the names and families of these women, but recognizing their individuality, I think, is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Antonia, thank you so much for that. As a tour de force, my word, a lot to digest. And I wondered if I could just start off by asking you the extent to which people in Sri Lanka now are interested in this. You've referred to that, and are keen to engage, since this is a description of a point in time of life in then Ceylon as it was. Is there a lot of interest amongst people in Sri Lanka?
Yes, there seems to be, and especially at university level, which I'm really encouraged by. So the exhibition and the work that we were doing last year was largely focused at English speaking workshops for people for the British Council and universities, and also the British the Sri Lankan Institute of Architects has this kind of wide purview over the some of the university courses. They don't actually teach any, but they're involved in them. And I think that the interest comes from this kind of visual record that isn't necessarily missing, but isn't fully fledged. There's lots of pockets of images. Many of the photographs that are in the country are of colonial buildings and colonial people, or they're of servants of colonial overseers who are standing incredibly stiffly, looking really awkward. And even though these images are posed, they do hold incredible amounts of value for the kind of cultural conversation that was happening at the time around different socioeconomic sort of people across the country. So I think they hold lots of keys to understanding some of the practices that are still happening, like tea plucking, or have completely vanished, like the pearl oystery industry.
Lovely, thank you. I see there's a question from Morag Cross in the Q&A box, who says, so the modern Sri Lankans go overseas to recover digitally their own heritage, even if they can't or wouldn't want to possess Hornell's decorative paintings. how interested are they in the travellers or colonialists' photos and paintings? Well, you've, I think, spoken to that. But would there be anything
Yeah.
else you'd like to add to that?
So I think what's interesting is there are some there are some digital archives in Sri Lanka, but because the period at this period is still under colonial rule, there's the large portion pre 1948 got brought home to Scotland or to Wales or Ireland or wherever these people were from. And similarly, paintings in the previous era would have gone back to Portugal and to the Netherlands when it was under their rule. And so I think that's why we have so many images like this across the country. And I'm finding more and more little snippets of things. There were commercial studios in Sri Lanka, and there are archives in Sri Lanka that are really key and important. So I'm not saying that everything is not there. It's just that often the people with the money and the means were those who were coming to work for the colonial government or were traveling and relying on the services of their friends and the colonial government. So when I went there, the interest in the photographs was enormous. Paintings less so, which I find interesting, partly because they're sort of imaginary imaginings. But I do think that there is an interest in the colonial travelers that were going around harvesting these images, where they were going, what impact they were having, and what they were taking with them. But I'm not getting the impression that very much of this has happened yet. So I'm hoping that this will be the start of more interest in trying to dig out these archives and trying to find more pictures that kind of, flesh out the images, I suppose, of that moment in time.
Well, we've
She's
we've
more like
noticed this
the
as yeah, we've
oh,
noticed this
some,
as we've noticed this as well in
mm,
China, where there's a
mm.
great interest in photographs taken of people's ancestors, as it were, and it's the Chinese themselves who were commenting on how interesting that was.
Yeah,
And
Morag has just said
yeah,
something. She was saying, I'm thinking of colonial engineers,
yeah,
etc., recording landscapes or their servants in watercolors. Yeah, yeah, there's a huge interest in that. I think Hippolyte's huge amounts of watercolors, the Indian artist that I showed. But yeah, there's more and more to dig up. So yeah.
fascinating. And you have projects in mind for other parts of Asia, other countries that you talked about Japan, I think,
Yeah,
several times.
so the man I showed you, William Kimon Burton, he's a really fascinating man. He's one of many who went over to Japan. His sister met Hornel when he was in Japan, when Hornel and Henry were there in 1893, 94. William Kimon Burton's sister was a muralist as well, and she did some murals in Scotland, some of which have been destroyed, some of which haven't been found, and some of which we know about. There's a property in Edinburgh on Ramsay Gardens where there's a couple of murals by her. And I'm trying to track down. She went over and traveled with her brother and met one of the commercial photographers that her brother was working with, and did a lot of watercolors, collected woodblock prints, and his brother did photographs. And a researcher and I have been looking at the tour that she did, going into quite a large portion of the country. And I'm trying to locate some of her watercolors, which she sold in London a few years after she got back, and they're sort of all asunder in private collections. So I'm quite interested in following that path as well.
Well, hopefully, someone who's been watching and listening this really, really excellent presentation will come back to you
I
with
hope
answers
so.
to those questions.
Yeah,
So,
welcome to get in
so
touch with me.
Antonia, we've come to the end of our time. I think there was one more Q&A that just popped up there. Did you see that?
That's Morang again saying, I'm sure the Japanese would be interested. They've still got a very unusual way of teaching their own past. The Japanese
Yeah,
friends say they didn't undertake much archaeology because they were afraid it would link too much to Korea. How interesting.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, our hour is up, and Antonio, again, thank you so much. It's exciting to have started off on this partnership with the National Trust for Scotland. Lots of things to look at going forward, and we very much look forward to staying in touch with you and through our members engaging. Our next event actually is to do with China on November the 12th, when we're doing the book launch of Living with Dragons, a book written by Giles Chance about the time that he was spending after Mao in China. And that will be held at the New Club on the 12th of November at 6 o'clock in the evening. So if you're able to come, please do, and let the people who follow you on the National Trust for Scotland know as well. But it just
Yes, thank
remains
you
for
very
me to
much.
thank you so much on behalf of the Age of Scotland Institute, our members and followers. And this is a great start to what I know will be a very fruitful and meaningful relationship. Antonia,
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you for having me.
Not at
See you
all.
soon. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.